And welcome back. Finance Minister Tito Mboweni has painted a very bleak picture of the country's economic situation as South Africa battles the coronavirus. Now, the minister tabled his 2 trillion rand supplementary budget yesterday, saying that the country will likely borrow more money, it will miss its tax collection targets, and the minister also expects the economy to contract by 7.2%. And this on the back of bleak unemployment statistics at 30.1% and growing. And there's been much debate since the budget was delivered. Is it too little, too late, or can we actually make it through? So let's get some analysis now with political analyst Khaya Sithole, who joins us on the line now. Khaya, good morning. Thanks for your time.
Good morning, and good morning to the viewers.
Now, firstly, your thoughts on the 2 trillion rand supplementary budget speech yesterday. And one of the key criticisms so far has been that there was simply not enough details. But what are your views on it?
I think it was a bit disappointing in relation to the details that we expected. Because remember, the key issue here is that this budget was really confirming what everybody knew or what everybody suspected, in that the state of public finances was not only dire to begin with, but it deteriorated significantly since, of course, the beginning of the year and since the last time the finance minister had tabled a form of a budget in February. So this was really confirming that, yes, indeed, it has deteriorated. But I think what people were then expecting is that if you're going to call us and say there's an emergency conversation to be had about the budget, you can't simply say, yes, it's as bad as you think it is, without actually then giving us a roadmap of how to make it better or how to recover from where we were. So I felt that on the part of asking, well, what happens next, it was a bit weak on these details, and I think for us, it was simply a matter of telling us what it is that we already suspected without actually telling us how to get up from it or how to recover from it. I also thought it was quite strange that even at this stage, the IMF conversations have not been finalized, because you'd have thought that this should have been treated with a sense of urgency that would have meant that by the time you say there is a budget to be tabled, you already know what it is that you're going to get and where you're going to get it from, and then tell us how you're going to use it in order to achieve the best outcomes.
So what we did get was that government says its projected gross national debt will be close to 4 trillion rand, or 81.8% of GDP by the end of this fiscal year, talking about 100% debt to GDP ratio by 2024. And this compared to an estimate of 65.6% of GDP projected in February, Khaya. The minister, Tito Mboweni, says that government expects the South African economy also to contract by 7.2% this year as the coronavirus continues to ravage the local economy. But what does all of this mean to the ordinary South African?
I think really the sum of what we heard yesterday is that we are in a bit of a crisis. And I think this economic crisis is really a question of we do not have enough money that we're generating from taxes in order to fund our spending as a country. So the impact on the ordinary South African is that a lot of what we expect the state to deliver on is going to be highly compromised on the basis that there simply isn't enough money going around. So, of course, every single department and every single government agency is then going to have to expect that there will be at least some cut on what it had been receiving before, and then that has significant impact on the service delivery aspects in most aspects. So I do think that for a lot of South Africans, this is going to have consequences, maybe not overnight, but in the long run, we're all going to see that the capacity of the state to make some of the things that it has committed to actually happen is going to be a bit compromised.
And looking at the debt situation, the finance minister says, Khaya, that South Africa faces a huge debt crisis unless that deficit is stabilized. So talks about how the country has much strength, but debt is our biggest problem. He also says that out of every rand that we pay in tax, 21 cents in the rand goes to paying off interest on our past debt. So does this indebtedness actually condemn us to even higher interest rate, firstly? And how do we go about stabilizing the situation?
Unfortunately, yes. So what happens is that if you have the type of debt profile that we have, it means that for anyone else that might want to lend to us in the future, they will simply say, look, guys, you already are overexposed in terms of interest payments. So if I borrow you an additional amount, I'm also taking on a huge risk that you might actually not be able to pay me back. So that will mean that those people actually demand even more in the forms of interest. So it does actually condemn us to paying even more in future interest costs, which is very, very, very problematic, because you end up trapped in this cycle that in order for you to be able to do anything, you have to go and raise money. But everybody that you can raise money from looks at you with some very suspicious and very skeptical eyes and simply says, look, based on the fact that you've actually just got a very bad credit record or a very bad credit profile, we're actually going to increase the interest that you're charging. And remember, this is also reflected in what we call the ratings. So when somebody says you've been downgraded to junk status, it immediately means that whoever lends to you is going to expect higher interest anyway, because that rating on its own implies to people that your capacity to pay all your debts and obligations is actually not very strong. And that's where we find ourselves now, which is really the great modern day tragedy of South Africa.
And then on the other hand, one of the other great tragedies is, of course, the high unemployment rate, which was already a problem even before the advent of COVID-19. 30.1%, we are told, the official rate of unemployment, and growing, Khaya. So when it comes to the job situation, government has set aside 100 billion rand, and this, of course, is a multi-year economic support package in order to respond to the country's jobs crisis. So looking at that situation, and the minister saying, of course, that the president's job creation and protection initiative will be rolled out over the medium term. But how effective do you believe this will be in terms of actually stemming those job losses and getting South Africans back to work? Because how do you stimulate the economy if South Africans are not working?
It is really difficult, and I think the Stats SA data that we saw the day before the budget really indicated how dire the situation has become. And remember, Sakina, the problem with that data is that data is probably the data that was extracted long before we really felt the economic impact of the hard lockdown, the level 5 lockdown. So the next time Stats SA publishes the data, it is expected to be much worse. And I think obviously the unemployment crisis is a long-standing crisis that the state should have done more to deal with. And my suspicion is that whenever we hear that there's going to be some form of intervention in the long term, it doesn't give the impression that the government understands the urgency of the situation. And of course, a number of 100 billion rand is completely insufficient to deal with the type of crisis that we have. We now know that even on an annual basis, far too many people enter the workplace or the world of work compared to the number of jobs that get created. So this actually creates an escalation in the unemployment queue. So for me, it is an urgent crisis that the state actually needs to be far more innovative in dealing with. And I think when we call for innovation, the state needs to make peace with the fact that the way it has approached it, the way it has dealt with it historically, quite simply hasn't worked. If you look at the track record over the past 10 to 15 years, they've always said they're putting initiatives in place, but none of these have actually translated into a huge reform or a huge dent in the unemployment conversation. And I think just saying 100 billion rand in the medium term is unfortunately not going to be very useful to somebody out there who's been out of the job market for the past couple of months due to the pandemic, and to someone who's been out of the job market for more than a year on the basis that the job opportunities aren't even there. And I think, Sakina, perhaps the most glaring stat that we saw this week was the fact that even in the unemployment numbers, the 7.1 million people classified as unemployed, 70% of them had actually been unemployed for more than a year, which means that their prospects of actually getting back into the job market are diminishing every single day, because if you've been looking for a job for an entire year and you can't find it, the cost of actually carrying on looking is even higher because you have no alternative sources of income. So while for somebody who has a job, traveling to one agency to deliver a CV might be affordable because they still have a job or some form of income, a person who hasn't had an income for an entire year might not be in a position to travel to that place to deliver a CV if necessary.
Looking at how to get South Africans back to work, the Sustainable Infrastructure Development Symposium from 2 days ago, there was talk there, about investing in infrastructure so as to try and stimulate this economy and thereby getting people to work. What's your view on that, Khaya? how much would we actually have to spend to make any sort of wave and some sort of dent into that unemployment number?
Look, the important thing about the infrastructure drive is that we now know that the construction sector, for example, is quite a high-volume employer. And this was even reflected in the data from Stats SA that we saw this week, where they looked at the share of the contribution to GDP made by the construction sector versus the share of employment. And of course, those numbers indicate that whilst it may have a smaller contribution to GDP, it has a huge impact on employing people. So you do want to then focus on those types of sectors, those types of industries that are capable of attracting a lot more people and absorbing a lot more people. Construction is one example. Tourism is another example. So I think then focusing on those types of initiatives is going to be an important one. Again, our biggest problem as a country is that the government has got a very poor track record of translating these type of talk shops into actual action, into actual, implementable actions. And I think for me, the problem here is a question of, now that you've told us that there are commitments in the pipeline, the firm commitments, what does it mean? When do we get to see the first construction project being undertaken, and how long will it take for that type of construction project to reach the scale that we can then say this is employing a lot more people than before, so therefore it's making a dent in the unemployment queue. So it is an important initiative, but of course, until it starts getting delivered, it is nothing more than just one additional speech that the government has delivered.
So, Khaya, Minister Mboweni also saying that 21.5 billion rand has been allocated for healthcare as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic, because all of these problems, of course, primarily needs to take cognizance of the fact that this is, in the first instance, a health issue. So let's talk to that and the realities on the ground. We still have to contend with what one could perhaps describe as a corruption ecosystem, even during the time of COVID-19.
It is quite a difficult one, because I think we do all acknowledge that we need to spend as much money, allocate as many resources to just the healthcare initiatives. But of course, if you have this instance of far too many rands disappearing in the system through overinflated prices and rigging and all of those things, it doesn't lend much credibility to the government's initiatives. And I think for me, that long-standing credibility crisis that the state has means that for a lot of people, they hear that 21 billion rand is going to be allocated, but the bigger question is, will there actually be a 21 billion rand impact on the healthcare system itself? And until people start seeing that, yes, there will definitely be an impact that matches what the sacrifice is, what the collective sacrifice is, these things are just becoming very, very, very difficult for us to digest, and people are going to stop taking them seriously.
And just a final question, Khaya. All these numbers, we can talk until we blue in the face, but unless there is some tangible action that comes out of this, unless people actually start seeing the jobs being created, unless we start seeing that things are actually changing, we do face a very great reality of civil instability unless we get this right, especially if you look at the unemployment numbers, the inequality that is rising. How does government deal with this?
I think, just the sheer volumes of people that are out of work, that are actively looking for a job and are unable to secure a job is a huge risk for the country. And I think if we're talking about 11 million people that are frustrated by the fact that they are looking for opportunities, desperate for opportunities, and are unable to secure them, it is not inconceivable that we might actually end up with some form of civil unrest where people might even say, we'll take to the streets until we can actually see what the government is doing about this jobs crisis. And I think the talk shops themselves aren't going to be the answer that people are demanding at that point in time. So I do think that we are facing an increasing risk of that form of instability, simply because the situation as it is quite simply will not do in the long run, and the state needs to be far more innovative and far more creative in actually finding a way of saying, let us make some inroads into this unemployment crisis. And I think so far people just haven't seen that type of commitment or that type of clarity of vision that then says, now we understand what the roadmap is, now we understand when my next opportunity to get a job might be. Until you get there, this is indeed an escalating crisis.
Khaya Sithole, thanks so much for your time. Khaya, of course, an analyst, and speaking to us there about yesterday's budget speech, the supplementary budget speech delivered by Minister Tito Mboweni, and some of the impact that may have. And that brings us up to news time.